Many have asked me to do more episodes on Hollywood, and today we're going to be talking about Hollywood. It's called The Hollywood Murders. Yes, Hollywood has a lot of glitz and glamour. A lot of tourists want to come out here and see Hollywood. But there's another side to it. Today we're going to be talking about the silent movie theater where the owner-operator is murdered. Why? Who would want to do it? He was so well liked in the community. Then we're going to go on and talk about what I consider the most gruesome set of murders. Where did they occur? When did they occur? And who was involved in it? And how was it solved? So let's get into the facts of the murders of Hollywood, the dark side you generally don't see. Well, what is our topic today? Hollywood murders, better known as the Rodriguez Van Sickle case, as well as the Kevin Graff case. Well, let's get to the first case. What does it involve? Well, it's a robbery of a Hollywood theater, in particular the Silent Movie Theater on Fairfax Avenue in West Los Angeles. They were selling tickets in the ticket booth there. Larry Austin was the owner and operator of the Silent Movie Theater, and it was a business. It looked like a good, successful, and then all of a sudden, a man appeared on the side, and he pointed a gun at Larry Austin. Said, "Give me all your money, give me all your money." You know, it didn't take him long to realize it was a robbery, and Larry Austin didn't want any difficulty, so he leaned down and he grabbed all the money, all the cash that he had collected, and he got it, and he stood up and walked over to hand it to the robber. And as he's doing that, the robber shoots him, and Larry Austin falls over dead. He had been shot several times right there in the ticket booth. He was working there by himself. Right next to him was the concession clerk. Why? Why was he shot? He was in the process of handing over the money. Well, it wasn't long before the police came out and responded, and as soon as they got there, they realized, oh, they're going to need the homicide detectives, because it looked like a robbery homicide. Well, there was a bloody bag. Next to it, it had all this cash. The money was there, and it hadn't been taken. It seemed very, very strange to the detectives. Why? Why was the money left behind? They checked out the scene. It was a bloody, bloody scene because Larry Austin had blood out there. And it seemed like he was shot at a close range. Why would a robber get at a close range to shoot a victim like that? Next to him, a short distance away, was where the concession clerk was standing. She was selling popcorn, candy, soft drinks, and she was shot as well by the robber. And she's hit several times, but they're kind of superficial. She's taken to the hospital, but she survives her injuries. But after that, the robber ran into the theater. Instead of running out on the street, he ran in there and he started firing his gun in the theater. And it was right along this, here, this is the aisle that he ran down. He stopped where that red circle is. He stood there, shot the gun in the air, and everybody in the audience, stared and looked right at him. They got a very good look at him as to who he was. And then he proceeded down to this exit, went through that door, and went out into the patio area and escaped through the gate at the back that goes to the alleyway. Wow, that's what happened to the robber. Now, it didn't look like a usual robber, and Larry Austin, he was liked by all. I mean, he had been there for years, and the moviegoers, they were fond of him. He was always cheerful, and he liked putting on these old silent movies. It looked like an intentional killing. Why would anyone want to kill Larry Austin? Silent movie. Theater had been there since 1942. And a very popular place. It showed silent movies ever since then, for a number of decades. And it was well known by moviegoers. And many movie stars would go over there to look at the old silent movies. Now, the theater wasn't a large venue. It only had 158 seats, but it was kind of intimate, and it was totally different. What was unique about it was it didn't have any sound system. They only had an organist. Now, there was a gentleman who was, 88 years old, and he would come every single night, and he'd play the organ. So every night, he would play whatever they were showing. That night in particular, they were showing Sunrise. Now, that was one of the old favorite silent movies that a lot of people like to come see. And goes back to, when did silent movies begin? They began back at the Nestor studio in 1911. Movies were being made back in New Jersey. Started out with Thomas Edison. But in New Jersey, the weather wasn't always that good, especially in the wintertime. So that was when they decided to move to Hollywood, because they could film all year long. And this was the first studio on Sunset Boulevard at Gower. And eventually it was called Columbia Studios. The first full-length movie was back in 1912, and it's called The Squaw Man. And it was filmed inside, it was kind of like a barn, and that was it, right there on Sunset and Vine Boulevards. Now, the first big movie that people recognize was back in 1915. It was called Birth of a Nation, and it was all filmed here at the majestic Reliance Studio on Sunset Boulevard. And the female star in it was Lillian Gish. Wow, that was, people liked movies, especially these big movies that they were putting out, very popular. And one of the big ones was in 1919, Intolerance. D.W. Griffith. He filmed it there. It was a Babylonian set, and it kind of became the symbol for Hollywood. The Egyptian, Babylonian pillars and temples, all done in the back lot there. Well, there was many more studios that came to Hollywood. The Dixon studio became the 20th Century Fox. And the one that still exists in Hollywood today is Paramount. It started out as United Studios in 1926 and is the only remaining major studio in Hollywood. Now, the movie stars, Charlie Chaplin is recognized most likely as the most popular and well-known, and he got into production of movies as well, and this is his studio, the Chaplin Studios, and this is where he did The Gold Rush, one of his favorite movies. And Mary Pickford became a big star back in 1912. She and Douglas Fairfax started the United Artists. They did theater as well as studios. So they produced a lot of movies. And who were the big stars of the movies? Harold Lloyd, I did a lot of them. Buster Keaton, Laurel and Hardy, all of these did these silent movies. Of course, Laurel and Hardy went on into the talkies. Well, what happened in 1927? Well, The Jazz Singer was the first motion picture with sound. And it was Al Jolson who sang these words, and it was, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet? Wait a minute, I tell you, ain't heard nothing. You want to hear toot, toot, tootsie? All right, hold on. And then he started playing the piano. Those were the first words ever spoken on a motion picture. Well, it became something very popular, and the one that everyone remembers is Al Jolson doing Mammy at the end of that movie. So, yes, talkie movies caught on, and that was the death of the silent movies back in 1927. So the studios didn't want those motion pictures, the silent motion pictures, so they were put in vaults, and they wanted to empty them. They wanted to get rid of them. The studios, all they wanted to do were talkies. Now, it was kind of interesting. A man by the name of John Hampton, he liked those old silent movies, and he went and he bought them all from the studios. And he collected them all, and then he started showing them in this silent movie theater. And he lived there upstairs, and he stored them all. There was most likely thousands of reels of these silent movies. Now, let's get to our date that we're talking about, January 17, 1997. The box office is ready. Larry Austin is selling tickets there. It was filling up. The projectionist had all the reels on. Everything was ready. And the theater opened up, and people came in to watch the first silent movie for the evening. Now, when the detectives got there, they checked out in the back there, and they found a place where it appeared the robber had sat. He sat right there, kind of obscured, nobody paid any attention to him, and he was drinking pink lemonade. He waited until the music, or the organist, got playing real loud, then he stepped out and he went over to the box office, and that was when he did the attempt robbery. Now here, upstairs, as I said, that was where Larry Austin lived, and that was where he stored all those old silent movies above the theater. Now by this time in 1997, they had become very, very valuable as collector's items, and certain people who wanted the history of the motion picture industry. Now several months later, after Larry Austin had been shot, there was no suspects, nobody knew who had done it, and a person came forth and said, I'm the owner of the silent movie theater and all those reels of silent movies. And he said, Larry Austin willed it all to me. His name was Jim Van Sickle. He claimed that, and he showed a will that was signed by Larry Austin, or at least had his name on it, and it willed everything to Van Sickle. Wow. Okay, how fortunate it was for this Van Sickle. However, the detectives got a phone call from not one person, but several people who called and said, you should check that out. I don't believe that Van Sickle really was willed all of that from Larry Austin. They said, yeah, true, they were partners. They lived together, and they lived together up above, and he was the projectionist. And he worked as a projectionist the night that Larry Austin was shot. But he didn't look anything like the shooter, because the shooter was young, Hispanic, and Van Sickle was older, and certainly wasn't looking like a Hispanic. So it wasn't adding up. So the detectives, checked out that name. But in the meantime, the detectives got a forensic artist together with the concession clerk. She was now out of the hospital, and they said, could you give us a description? Can we make a... And they did. They did a composite with the forensic artist, and this is what they came up with. The sketch of that robber, the person with the gun. And it was published in the Los Angeles Times, and there was this lady who got the newspaper. She looked at the newspaper, And she, that's my boyfriend. That's my boyfriend. And she contacts the detectives and says, you know, that composite looks like my boyfriend. I'm sure it's my boyfriend. And I said, well, okay, what's his name? And they said, Christian Rodriguez. Yeah. So the detectives now have a name, and they want to check it out. They go out and find him. They talk to him a while, and they decide to arrest him. So when they took him in for booking, he had a piece of paper on him. They didn't pay much attention to it, but they confiscated it. They put it into the booking envelope. And then one of the detectives looked at the phone numbers there, and he recognized the numbers. He remembered. He said, you know, when we had talked to Van Sickle and we were investigating him, because he claimed he had a will for the silent movie theater, there was a rental agreement. That was his name. And look at those phone numbers. They're the same phone numbers that Christian Rodriguez had in his pocket. Wow. What is the connection? Well, we checked the phone records and paging records and look at all the pages that went on between the two of them, between Van Sickle and Rodriguez. The murder occurred on January 17th of 1997. A number of phone calls before that, and then a lot of phone calls afterwards. So they're in constant contact with each other. So the detectives decide to interview Christian Rodriguez, and they sit down with him. They advise him of his Miranda rights. And, you know, he kind of hemmed and hawed for a minute, and they said, okay, I'll tell you what happened. What it was all about was this James Van Sickle, who I know, we had worked together. He'd come up to me and said, look, you know, would you be willing to kill this guy who owns the silent movie theater? His name is Larry Austin. I'll pay you $25,000 if you'd kill him, and I'll supply a gun for you. And then I'll give you another $5,000 if you kill the clerk, the concession clerk. And Christian said, well, you know, that was a lot of money. And he was willing to pay it to me. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And they came up with a plan where he would do the shooting, robbery, and then stand up in the audience so that everybody could see that he was a young Hispanic and didn't look anything like Van Sickle. So when it came to prosecution, the evidence that pointed to Rodriguez, there was a very strong case. There were that business card that Rodriguez had in his pocket, and all the pages between the two of them. And no question about it, it was a very strong case. But as to Van Sickle, when the detectives went out there and they interviewed him, gave him his Miranda rights, he refused to talk, wouldn't talk to him. So they're going to have a difficult time making a case, but they started building a case. They knew that they weren't going to be able to use Rodriguez to testify against Van Sickle, but they had this forged will, and they knew that they could tie it to Van Sickle because he was the one that put in a claim that the theater had been willed to him, and it was his. He had the strongest motive for getting rid of Larry Austin. So that was the case that they built. Anyway, after all the evidence was presented to the jury, both Christian Rodriguez and James Van Sickle were found guilty of first-degree murder, and they both received a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. So that was the end of the silent movie theater case, and the silent movie theater kind of came to an end. It was sold, and the building was remodeled, and it was bought by the Brain Dead Studio. They still show silent movies there occasionally, but that's what happened to the building. Now, to move on, let's talk about other gruesome murders that have occurred in Hollywood around the same time. It starts out with a Kevin Graff. He was, I guess you'd say, a homeless person. He had a criminal record of various, nothing serious, but always was getting into trouble, and he lived out of his truck. He had a Toyota truck, and that was home. Wherever he drove and parked that truck, that was his home. Now, you can see it was kind of messy. He didn't keep it very clean, but he was basically a homeless person in a truck. Now, we're going to talk about a very nice area of Hollywood. It's between Hollywood Boulevard and Sunset Boulevard near Fairfax. There were a number of houses there. A Mr. Robert Lee's residence is on Courtney, and a Dr. Ingelson's, his residence is on Stanley Street. They're back to back, so that shows you the locations. Now, Robert Lee, he was an elderly gentleman, and he was a screenwriter, and worked as a screenwriter for many years, and back in the 50s he was blacklisted. So it was hard for him getting work back then, but afterwards he did many screenplays for the motion picture industry. So this was his little house that he lived in for years. And the street behind that was Dr. Ingelson. He was retired from his medical practice, and he just bought the house behind on Stanley Street. And this kind of shows you where they're located. Now, this was Lee's house on Courtney Street. Now, there's a fence between the two houses, and on the next street over is the Stanley, is Ingelson's house. So that kind of gives you a picture as to where their two houses are located. Now, Graff, that morning he got up out of his truck, started wandering around looking for things to eat, and he goes by Lee's house and he sees that there is a side door, and he tries it, and he's able to get in. He walks in, and Robert Lee's is in the bedroom area, and Graff, gets a knife and just butchers Mr. Lee's, just butchers him up, cuts his organs out, slice him up, and then after he had killed him, he went over to Dr. Ingelson's house, slipped through a window there, got in, and Dr. Ingelson's on the phone and doesn't see him come in, and then Graff comes up with knives, a butcher knife, and slices him up, cuts out his heart, just totally brutalizes his body. After that, he goes out, gets Dr. Ingelson's car, and he steals it and drives off down Stanley Avenue. So that's where the various crimes occurred back to back. Now, let's talk about Robert Lee's. When Graff went in there and found him in the bedroom area, he killed him, chopped his body up, and here you can see he's lying there. He's covered with the clothing that he had dumped out of the dresser drawers. And after he had killed Mr. Lee's, he goes into the kitchen area. He goes into the refrigerator, and he takes out orange juice, he takes out various items to drink and to eat, sits at that table, has kind of a brunch, and fills himself up. And after he's finished, he sneaks out the back door. Then he climbs over this fence between the two houses. And there's a few blood stains right there on the wooden fence. And this is Dr. Ingelson's house. And he sneaks in through this window here. This is the window right there. He climbs in through that, and Dr. Ingelson is in another room on a phone trying to make reservations with Southwest Airlines. And then he Graff grabs some butcher knives, goes over and stabs Dr. Ingelson to death, and then just chops up his body and digs his heart out with the knife. And here you can see some of the knives that he used to butcher Dr. Ingelson. It was a bloody mess, just a bloody mess in killing Dr. Engelson. Well, this is where it all began. That was where Graf's truck was, right there on Hollywood Boulevard. Now, these are the two houses that we talked about earlier. And Dr. Engelson's car was stolen, and it was eventually found the following day, way down there on La Brea. And Mr. Lee's wallet is found over here in Sunset and La Cienega. And we're going to talk about this, the studio here. This is where Graf was eventually arrested. And how it all happened was Graf was hanging out in the cemetery, Hollywood Forever Cemetery, right there. You can see it. It is right behind the Paramount Studios. And it's a famous cemetery. Many of the important people, the stars of Hollywood, the DeMilles, Rudolph Valentino, Bugsy Siegel, were all buried there. And he is wandering through there, and he eventually comes over to the entrance to the Paramount Pictures. And there he's kind of going back and forth, and he kind of walks out into the traffic area. And eventually the guards there call the police, and the police come out and they check him out and realize that he's not in his right mind. So they arrest Kevin Graf right there. Now, what is the connecting evidence? Well, there's fingerprints that were found, and here there's it's a kind of a palm print that matches up with Graf, and these butcher knives, they have fingerprints on them, and when they check it out, they all come back to Kevin Graf's fingerprints. So that is one piece of evidence. And there's a necklace that was found at Mr. Lee's house, and here you can make it out. It was a necklace made up of chains wrapped around a wire. And Kevin Graf always wore that necklace. Every time he was booked, when he was arrested, he had that necklace on. That was kind of his pride and joy. But somehow it had fallen off at Mr. Lee's house. So as far as evidence, there was a tremendous amount of DNA evidence, of fingerprints, that chain we just talked about. So there was no doubt that there was a very strong case against Kevin Graf for killing Mr. Lee and Dr. Engelson. When all the evidence was compiled, he pled guilty. He pled guilty, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. That is what happened to, one of the most brutal murderers of Hollywood. Now, the more I think about Hollywood, I've gone there many times, this is where the silent movie theater was located on Fairfax Avenue. And this is where Mr. Lee, his house was down here, and Dr. Engelson's house was here, just off of Fairfax Boulevard, not too far, just maybe a mile apart, less than a mile. The more I think about it, maybe Hollywood is a nice place to visit, but I don't know if I'd want to live there. Well, hopefully you found this episode interesting, and if you want more details about the silent movie theater case, get my book, The Superstar Prosecutors, in which I spell out the investigation as well as the prosecution of the case to successfully prosecute both suspects. Well, please subscribe, and we generally have a new podcast every Friday at 3 o'clock. Well, hopefully you will join us again for another True Crime Files podcast when we review another case from beginning to end. See you then.